All right, we're back with Mark Collingsworth to talk about what happens down the road as the debt limit keeps being raised, which Mark says there's no way around. So, Mark, looking further down the road, you say this is going to continue constantly raising the debt ceiling. So, how much, how quickly, and what happens eventually by raising the debt limit constantly?
Well, the long-term problem, like I always like to tell people, Congress loves to kick the can down the road. No one really wants to take on the debt or the spending problem. They just want to print more and more debt and kick the can down the road. Eventually, the can gets tired and the can's going to kick back. And at some point, you just cannot keep just raising the debt ceiling. Give you an example. By my estimates, come 2030, the United States will have to be writing we have to issue $1 trillion in debt just to pay the interest payments. We'll be paying $1 trillion a year on U.S. debt in 2030. Give you an idea about how big $1 trillion is. What was happening 1 trillion seconds ago? 1 trillion seconds ago, which works out to about 28,000, roughly 28,000 years, cavemen were drawing paintings on cave walls. That's how big $1 trillion is. And our debt, we currently have $32 trillion in debt, and we pay $400 billion a year in interest payments currently. To give you an idea how big a billion is, do you know what was happening 1 billion minutes ago? Not seconds, 1 billion minutes ago. 1 billion minutes ago, the Roman Empire was invading Great Britain.
So, even $1 billion is something that most people have no concept of just how,
Yeah, no concept.
yeah. So, again, you say there's no way to get off this highway. We're going down this road. There's no exit ramp. So eventually we will default, and eventually the U.S. What happens?
Eventually will default. And people say, hey, the United States can keep on printing, can keep on issuing debt, keep on printing money, blah, blah, blah. If printing money made you a super strong economy, the country of Zimbabwe should be a superpower economically. Look what happened to Zimbabwe using the same strategy. There are just no two ways. We've already passed the point of no return. The government spending makes up 25% of all economic growth. Any cutback in government spending at this point will have a huge impact on economic growth.
So what you're saying is the U.S. is doomed economically. We're going to become a third world nation.
Sometime that's still going to be a while. Look at stuff like when Great Britain stopped being a superpower, or the Roman Empire. It's not something that happened in 20 or 30 years, but 50, 60 years down the road, people that grew up as small children noticed a huge difference by the time they were in their 70s, that the lifestyle they had totally changed. And I think that's where we're at. The children we have today that are like 5, 6 years old, they're going to look back when they're 70 years old and be like, hey, I remember the good old days when I was a 10-year-old. Things weren't like this.
All right. So next 5, 10 years, while we're still kicking, how much of a decline are we going to see?
I think probably what's going to happen in the next 10 years, you're going to have another really bad recession, which will require the government to do another huge stimulus package. And that stimulus package will probably be the last big stimulus package that they can do. And I'm talking about stimulus packages that last over several years, because my long-term outlook for the U.S. economy is not very good once we get past 2030, $1 trillion a year in interest payments. After that, I think the debt load becomes so large, global investors will be saying, hey, you have so much debt, you're going to have a higher interest rate, and that higher interest rate is going to be detrimental because at some point, everyone's enjoyed super low interest rates of 1% and 2% for the last, 20 years. Those days are gone. In the next 30 years, they're going to look back and say, ooh, 5% for a mortgage is a really good rate.
All right, Mark, getting back to the decline of other superpowers, you mentioned Britain a few minutes ago. Britain isn't a third world country. It's not the superpower, the global dominant power it once was, the British Empire upon which the sun never set. It's no longer those halcyon days, but it's not a third world country either. So, how bad will it get for the U.S. eventually?
Great Britain's not a third world country, but you have to admit the living standards in Europe have declined tremendously over the last 50 to 60 years. And I think the living conditions for the United States, 50 years down the road, they're going to look much more similar to what Europe's standard of living looks like today. Will look the same to the United States in roughly 50 years.
Now, will China simply take over the U.S. economically, if not politically or militarily?
In my opinion, I think China's already taken over the United States economically. One of the reasons why we have so much inflation in the United States today is because China shut down during the COVID stuff and weren't able to produce all those cheaper goods. Whereas the United States should have been able to produce those exact same goods at home at just as cheap a price, but they couldn't. That's why prices went up so much, is that China basically wasn't producing. Now China's starting to produce again, and you're going to start inflation. You're going to see inflation is going to start coming down over the next 2 or 3 quarters.
All right, you know what I'm thinking now when China becomes dominant. I mean, so far the decline of superpower is most lately Great Britain. They're not a third world country, although they're not what they used to be. But the mitigating factor there, as I see it, is that the U.S. became the dominant power, and we kept the severe consequences of repressive governments at bay. So, in a way, the U.S. shielded Europe and a lot of the rest of the world with our dominance. But once China becomes dominant, we won't, none of these nations, including ourselves, will have that protection anymore. So China will have its sway, and unless its political philosophies change, it's going to be a very repressive authoritarian government worldwide.
Correct, it will be. China's taking over a lot. I mean, they're buying up, farmland. They're controlling almost everything. A lot of people don't realize this, but the bulk of the antibiotics that come into the United States are actually made in China because they produce such a cheaper rate. And we've just given away so much. Really, today, the only thing the United States really does well is we make really great weapon systems. And then the question has to be, how long will that last if the Chinese keep stealing our technology and then duplicating on their side? Not to mention, which is I think this is really funny, the Chinese owns so much US debt that the interest payments that the United States makes every year to China on the US debt funds 100% of the Chinese military.
Incredible. Well, this raises the prospect of whether we are heading towards a military conflict with China that could erupt into a nuclear war, which could result in annihilation for both nations and a large part of the world. I mean, are we headed towards that future?
I don't know if you necessarily ever see a nuclear war because everybody knows it's a war that nobody wins. It's just one of those things that just it's a zero sum game. I don't think anybody want to go that direction.
But not perhaps not purposely, but things get out of control. Things escalate, mistakes are made. There are renegade generals on both sides, perhaps. I mean, it's a nightmare scenario of things getting out of hand unintentionally to begin with.
Well, one of the strategies when I took my Army strategy courses, we actually discussed going to war with China, what would be part of the strategy. And nukes were not the top way to defeat China. The main strategy for the U.S. government was a actually three pronged attack. One, you fly your bombers and their stealth bombers, and you drop pesticides on all the rice paddies. So you basically eliminate all the food supply of the Chinese. You got 1 billion people eating. It will not take them long at all to starve to death. You put your submarine fleet off the coast of China. You don't allow any ships to come in. Cut off that food supply, and you put the U.S. Army tanks in the deserts to the west of the coastline. A lot of people don't realize this. Those 1 billion people live within 50 miles of the Chinese coastline. Everything else in China is nothing but desert. And as you've seen from the Gulf Wars, we have some good tanks. You put those tanks out there, and there's no food supply coming into China. They starve. They starve in a matter of weeks. They're gone in a matter of weeks. No nukes.
And what would China's response be when we start doing that?
China would probably go to a nuclear strategy there, but I think that's a battle that would probably be lost. If you're familiar with Ronald Reagan and the Star Wars project, I am a strong believer that the Star Wars project was already up and running when Reagan actually asked for that funding, and he simply basically took a project that was already there and he made it 10 times better.
So we have that capability. China hasn't caught up to that yet, you assume, correct?
Have not. I've actually, I've just from talking to people who are supposed to be experts in this, I've actually heard that, Russia probably has the most advanced nuclear weapon arsenal on the planet. So the Russian arsenal is really the only one we really have to worry about. From my understanding, the United States actually has actually calculated that they can actually knock out 97%. If Russia was to launch missiles at us, they can actually knock out 97% of all those missiles before they actually hit the United States. So,
But the 3% that get through can do quite a bit of damage.
well, that's correct. 3%, they get through going to do a lot of damage, but that's 97% going up against an army that's supposed to have the best nuclear weapons in the world. I don't think China's up there in the same leagues as Russia. There's a chance you might knock out 100%.
All right, but getting back to the prospect of war with China, is that an increasingly attractive option for the U.S. before China is too big to confront militarily?
Well, Well, no, because to go to war with China, you're going to have a declaration of war signed by the by Congress. And why would Congress want to sign that when they're getting paychecks from China? They got secret bank accounts over there. They're getting, what's the guy in California who had a Chinese girlfriend that he was sleeping with every night, who was
Yes,
actually a Chinese spy?
yeah, that was Fang Fang, right?
Yeah,
Who was on the Intelligence Committee, by the way, and
yeah,
Pelosi refused to yank him off the Intelligence Committee even after this came out about the Chinese
exactly.
he was sleeping with. Yeah, but I mean, at some point, won't the leaders of the U.S., even though they're on the dole with China, don't they? Won't they realize that eventually, they've got their money from China, unless they go off on their private islands. Uh, the jig is going to be up for everybody, including those that are taking money from China. So, in other words, will they eventually see that the most survivable option would be going to war with China?
It might happen someday, but right now we get too many benefits from China. So I just don't see that on the horizon anytime soon.
So, in other words, they're selling their country out while they're making money on China. They don't care what happens down the line, where the country goes under because of how we're making these compromises with China to enrich themselves. They don't care down the line.
Correct.
They're just enjoying the upfront money and benefits.
Correct. It's kind of the same thing. The Federal Reserve is not a great system. People that put the Federal Reserve System in place, they knew it was a bunch of bull crap, but they reaped the benefits in the early days. Those people are dead now. They don't care. It's someone else's problem to deal with.
Yeah, in fact, throughout history, this has kind of been the pattern of empires in decline and finally going under, where everybody starts grabbing as much as they can, and hell be damned about what happens in the future. I mean, to some extent, that's what happened with Rome, wasn't it?
It sure was. That's actually why Julius Caesar was assassinated, because Julius Caesar saw the problems of what a democracy was doing to the country with the Senate, because the Senate became so corrupt and was taking payments. You elect these senators to represent you in the Roman Empire, but these same senators are taking payments from countries like Turkey, from Russia, to basically pass laws that benefit Turkey and benefit Russia at the expense of the Roman citizens. Julius Caesar had enough of it, and that's why Julius Caesar was going to try to overthrow the Senate and make Rome back into make Julius Caesar become a full-fledged king per se, and the senators killed him.
Yeah. So, in that respect, Caesar got a bad rap, that he was power hungry, but actually, he wanted to use that power to save the empire.
Correct.
Of course, the problem is once you give anybody that kind of power, do they remain incorruptible, or does absolute
That's
power corrupt them? Absolutely.
and that's the exact same thing that happened with the Roman Senate. After hundreds of years, it became corrupt. Would Julius Caesar have become corrupt himself? We don't know.
So, the parallels with the decline of Rome, decline and fall of Rome, those parallels are increasing in
Mhm.
terms of the U.S.
Yep, very much so.
And so it goes. All right. Mark Collingsworth, Bear Global Financial Wealth Management, while the wealth remains. Thanks for being with us once again.
All right. Thank you.